Have you ever had a fecal test come back showing few or even zero worm eggs, even though your goat looks like it's fighting a heavy parasite load? You are not alone, and that doesn't necessarily mean your goat is worm-free. Today, we're going to talk about all the reasons a fecal exam can underestimate the real number of worms inside your goat, because understanding these limitations can help you make better decisions about deworming and management. So let's get started. Reason number one, the most common reason for false negatives is old manure. I hear people do this all the time. This was a lesson that we learned 20 years ago, right after we first got goats, because my husband taught at a community college where they had a vet tech program. And you can imagine we were pretty excited when the professor came to my husband and said, "Hey, I just heard you guys got goats. I would love for my students to get the opportunity to do fecals on something other than dog and cat poop. Could you bring in some goat poop for our students to practice?" And my husband said, "Sure." So he went out to the barn and got a Ziploc baggie and he filled it up with all the goat poop that he could find from the barn floor. And he took it in, and the results came back. The vet professor was actually seemed a little disappointed. He said, "Well, your goats have no worm problems whatsoever. And believe me, we really checked." Like he had split up all of that poop amongst 20 students, and every single one of them found exactly 0 eggs in the poop. And so we were, of course, super proud of ourselves, thinking, "Yay, we got this. Our goats don't have worms. We're so awesome. Our goats are so awesome." And this ultimately caused a really big problem for us, because when our goats started having problems, we thought our goats don't have worms. And that was completely wrong, because if you pick up pellets from the barn floor or the pasture or your dry lot, they've likely been sitting there long enough for the worm eggs to hatch, especially in warm, humid weather. Once the eggs hatch, you're not going to see anything in the sample. So the microscope shows 0 eggs, even though the goat could be infected, even heavily infected. So for an accurate result, you need fresh pellets, ideally collected directly from the goat's rectum. But if that's not possible or grossing you out, then you just need to gather them immediately as soon as the goat poops and store them in a sealed container in the refrigerator, not the freezer, because in the freezer, you're going to make them burst, until they are tested, hopefully within 24 hours. Reason number 2 that your goats could have a worm infection, but your fecal looks negative. After infection, there is what is called a pre-patent period. And that's the time between when a goat eats infective larvae and when those larvae mature enough to start laying eggs. It's the same idea as an incubation period in a microbial infection. For barber pole worm, that's about 3 weeks. Barber pole is a blood-sucking larva at that time, but it is not mature and it's not laying eggs. So if you do a fecal test shortly after infection, you can find 0 eggs or a very low number of eggs, even though the worms are already growing and feeding on your goat's blood and causing them to become anemic. And they're about to mature and start laying eggs. Now, some people tell me that their goat can't possibly have a worm problem because they had a clean fecal last month, but a lot can change in a month when a goat has worms. Number 3, in cold weather or when the goat's immune system is fighting hard, some worms go into a dormant stage inside the stomach wall called hypobiosis. They aren't laying eggs during this time, so your fecal results will look low, even if your goat has a significant hidden population that could emerge later when conditions are right. One of the most common times for hypobiosis to end is after a doe kids, because her immune system can take a big hit during kidding. This is why you might have heard about the postparturient egg rise, which basically means that when your goat kids and you do a fecal, it could be much, much higher than it was last week. And so, a lot of people are like, "Oh, well, they've done studies and they found that, goats, the fecal egg count goes up after kidding." And yes, that's true. However, if the goat's not sick, the goat doesn't need a dewormer because dewormers, drugs are for sick animals. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that this means that you automatically deworm all does after kidding, which is a very old idea. And it's a bad idea because every time you use a dewormer, you take a step closer to dewormer resistance. So you should only give dewormers to sick animals. We have a whole episode of the podcast on worms and kidding. So I can't get into it too much here, but if you're interested, check out that episode. Number 4, fecal samples are small. You are just testing a very tiny percentage of the manure, and the number in every sample is going to be a little different, sometimes drastically different. In fact, I used to hear this a lot, but and I didn't quite believe it, but eggs are not evenly distributed in a sample, and your goat isn't shedding many that day, then you could get a low count purely by chance. That's why fecal egg count should be viewed as an estimate, not an exact number. So the story that I can tell you that really made this hit home for me was back when the second edition of Raising Goats Naturally was published in 2018. There was a TV station that wanted me to come in and do an author spot, talk about my new book. And they said, bring goats. And so I, of course, said yes, because what goat owner doesn't want to show off their goats? So I took Agnes, who was one of my sweetest does, and I took her daughter, who was also one of my sweetest does. And it was a 3-hour drive. And I thought, well, I have to put hay in their crates so that they're not hungry on the drive. So they were eating hay for a good portion of that drive. And we get there, we go into the studio. You know what TV studios look like, right? It looks like somebody's living room. So we go in there and both Agnes and her daughter immediately start pooping all over the studio because goats are not housebroken. They just let the poop fly whenever the urge hits. So as you can imagine, a lot of city slicker TV people who had no experience with goats started to freak out. This is also when I learned that a lot of the furniture and stuff in TV studios is rented, and the rug that the goats were pooping on was rented. And so even though it was these perfect, beautiful dry pellets that they could just sweep onto a dustpan, they were really upset. And so Agnes and her lovely daughter immediately got evicted to the TV station garage, which again, didn't even know TV stations had garages, but I got to see one firsthand with Agnes and her daughter. So I had a farm intern with me at the time. She stayed in the garage with Agnes and her daughter while I went back into the studio to do the interview. And they had a photographer in the garage to cut to Agnes and her daughter at appropriate times during my interview. And it all went very lovely. And we loaded them up and drove back to the farm. As soon as we get to the farm, Agnes and her daughter jumped out of the minivan, and her daughter immediately started pooping. And instead of beautiful, perfect little goat berries, it looked like raisinets mixed into fettuccine. She dumped the biggest load of tapeworms I have ever seen in 23 years of goat ownership. And first of all, they're tapeworms. So tapeworms are not dangerous for goats. They don't actually cause a problem. In fact, one vet I know says that tapeworms are worse for the mental health of the owner than they are for the physical health of the goat. So anyway, I was incredibly relieved that they had not done that in the TV studio, because I could only imagine how upset they would have been if they would have seen that, because I'm sure anybody in there that owns dogs would know, like, oh my gosh, they have worms if they saw that mixed into the poop. So that showed me right there that even something as big as tapeworms, you can have very intermittent shedding. So you can't assume that just because this fecal is really low, that is necessarily the truth. So I always say a fecal can confirm, but not rule out a heavy worm load. So Reason number 5 is seasonal and individual variability. Goats are going to shed more eggs in warm, wet weather when conditions are perfect for worms to reproduce. And if it's dry or really cold, like here in Illinois in the middle of our frozen winters, we don't see a heavy worm load in most goats. When a goat's immune system suppresses egg production during those times, your fecal egg counts are going to look deceptively low. And so this is why somebody, might do a fecal egg count before kidding and go, oh, it's really low, I don't have anything to worry about. But a week after kidding, it could be really high. Some goats are just what they call low shedders that may have big worm burdens without showing many eggs in their fecal samples. Reason number 6 that your fecal might be wrong and misleading is that they are not all created equal. If the flotation solution's specific gravity isn't right, some goat eggs can sink. Remember, parasites are species specific. So the worms that your goat has are very different than the worms that dogs and cats have. If the slide sits too long before they look at it, the eggs can hatch. In fact, again, another lesson I learned, I had a slide that had eggs on it. I was like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of eggs here. And I came back a couple days later, wanted to show it to somebody, and there was nothing on it. So that's why it's really important that you use a trained vet or a lab familiar with goat fecals, because goat eggs are smaller than those of dogs, cats, cattle, even horses. So accurate technique and using the correct flotation solution really matters. Again, because we had so many problems with worms 20 years ago, these are all things that I learned all the way back then. I had been having my fecals done at the local dog and cat vet. And when I took my goat to the University of Illinois Vet Hospital, the first thing that professor there said to me was a dog and cat fecal flotation is not going to float all of the goat worm eggs. So it's really important that they're using the correct fecal flotation solution. It's also a really good idea to get a McMaster's fecal rather than a simple fecal flotation that they do on dogs and cats. You can ask, it's really a good idea to ask, but if you forget to ask ahead of time, if your vet tells you something like, oh, we saw 32 eggs and they're getting freaked out about that, that means they did a fecal flotation. They counted 32 eggs on the whole slide. And that might be a big deal if your dog has whipworms, but that is not a big deal if your goat has roundworms, including barber pole worms, because barber pole worms, a McMaster's fecal egg count, they're going to say something like 600 or 1,000 or 1,500 or even 5,000. Goat fecal numbers are much, much higher than dog and cat numbers. And that's why it's really a good idea to have a McMaster's fecal done, because they've got it's a special slide. It's not just a simple glass slide with a slip on the top. Now, we have just talked about 6 of the most common reasons why a fecal can confirm but not rule out a parasite load. I started teaching people how to raise goats as an instructor for the University of Massachusetts in 2013. And for the last 12 years, I have seen far too many people assume that they didn't have a worm problem simply because a fecal didn't show a high number. And I'm not the only one who no longer puts my faith in fecals 100%. This is why the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control now recommends that you do the 5-point check to determine whether your goat needs deworming. And I have a whole podcast episode on what the 5-point check is and how to do it. The best part is that it's free and you can do it every single day to keep a close eye on your goat's health. So you will know, because some goats can have a fecal egg count of 1,500 and be fat and healthy, where another goat can have a fecal egg count of 300. They can be skinny, anemic, and have diarrhea. And So the fecal egg count is not necessarily a good indicator of whether or not your goat needs a dewormer. So I see that there are a few comments in the comment section, and Judy says, can you drop a link on how to detect worms on a budget? I do my own fecals because the vets around here do not see goats. Yes, the 5-point check. That's it. So I actually learned how to do fecals about 20 years ago, maybe 21 years ago, because we had so many goats dying from worms. I haven't done a fecal in at least 5 years, maybe 7 or 8 years, because a fecal never once changed my mind on whether or not I needed to give a goat a dewormer. Like I said, it can confirm but not rule out the fact that your goat has a high worm load. So if your goat is anemic, they're either their stool is poopy or not poopy, clumpy, or diarrhea. They've got a poor body condition. Definitely, if they have bottle jaw, they need a dewormer. So bottle jaw doesn't happen very often. So usually it's the 3 main ones that you see are going to be anemia, poor body condition, and they're not going to be pooping pebbles. So anyway, you want to do the 5-point check because that is going to give you the information that you need. I will drop a link. So here's a link to the 5-point check for parasites that you can use to find out. So basically, back when I was doing fecals, I would do the 5-point check, and it would be like the goat is anemic, they're skinny, they're pooping logs or diarrhea. So I would do the fecal, and of course the number would be sky high, and it was like, okay, that was a waste of time. This goat needs a dewormer. And so I did wind up, it really always confirmed it, that I needed to do it. And so it just felt like I said, a waste of time. So if you are watching this later and you have any questions, feel free to post in the comment section below and we will get back to you. Bye for now.